Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. A special welcome to Marvin Kalb, CBS and NBC News correspondent, analyst, and anchor, now a senior fellow at the USC Annenberg Center on Communication, Leadership, and Policy. This forum is on the record and is being recorded. The video will be posted on our website shortly. Our next USC Annenberg Washington program will be on Wednesday, April 23rd at 12 noon Eastern Time, Cyber Securing Democracy, our spring election cybersecurity forum with speakers including Kim Wyman, Homeland Security's point person for the 2022 election cycle, who will present a proposal for comprehensive election security and training. Now to Marvin Kalb. Marvin, Washington is so quiet these days that we were wondering whether you'd find anything to discuss, but you may have a few talking points, starting with a bit of history.
A bit of history, indeed. I tell you, so many crazy things have been happening, and happening so quickly. It puts all of us in a state of unease, without any doubt, and some of us in a state of absolute fear. And so I was looking at a history book the other day, and I was coming upon a founding father's definition of democracy. We know that in the last couple of years, there have been many books put out by first-rate scholars about democracy and the threat to American democracy. So I was going back. What is it that the founding fathers had in mind? Something very simple, but very important. They had in mind, first of all, that they would set up a government that consisted of three co-equal branches of government. But there was one point that undergirded the entire system, and that was that the executive branch of government be the least powerful of the three. What do they have in mind? We were in a revolution, revolting against what? A king in England. They did not want a king as president. They did not want a president, and Washington understood this. They did not want a president who was seeking greater and greater power, as though he knew what was best for everybody. They had in mind that the Congress would be the most important branch of government because it represented the people. What has now happened? If we seek a modern definition of democracy based upon the founding fathers' principle of democracy, what do we find? We find that the executive branch of government, far from being the least significant, has become the most significant. Donald Trump today strides across this country like a giant. He is in charge, and if you don't believe him, ask. He'd be happy to give you a speech on the subject. And the other two branches of government have become most subservient to his interest, particularly the Congress, which is subservient, obedient, honorable, respectful, saying sir whenever they refer to the president. And today there was a vote in the House that they're going to proceed, Republicans will proceed, very narrow majority, but proceed with the president's big bill. He calls it a beautiful bill that will take care of all of our problems, economic, political, foreign policy. What about the judicial branch of government today? That's very complicated. It's sort of split down the middle. There is a group of courageous lawyers, constitutional scholars, who are fighting very hard to accent the importance of the law as the governing factor in this country, the basis of what it is that the executive branch is supposed to do. But there is the other side of the judicial branch today, represented by the Supreme Court, which bends over backwards to accommodate the executive branch of government. So if you take a look at it, it's not three co-equal branches, it's one at the very top of two that are much lower than that. And if you think about that for a sec, since that's so totally different from what the founding fathers had in mind, where are we then today as a nation if you compare reality today to what it is then? My sense, and I hope I'm wrong, but my sense is that America today is a land in fear. It is fear based upon an uncertainty about what it is that is going to happen, not just to your own piggy bank, but what is going to happen to the country writ large. I know from journalists, from friends of mine who are currently 100% involved in journalism, they make their living reporting the news. They report to me about a fear in the newsroom. And then I think about friends who tell me about fear in their law firm, fear that the president may take action against their law firm, and fear especially at universities, not just the University of Southern California, Harvard, Princeton, places like that, fear even in small universities that would consider themselves conservative because of location, in the South, for example. And there too, there is fear. I hear about a young graduate student at a Southern university who is studying German history, wants very much to pick up an opportunity to spend the summer in Germany, sharpening her German language, as well as being able to deal with the German people today who are in the midst of their own chaos. And she has been informed by her university to be very careful about two things: the people that she communicates with in Germany. Who are these people? Do you know their political backgrounds? Where have you heard that? And also be careful when you come back in what it is that you say to the agent at the airport when you come back in. Because there are opportunities, it's not for everybody at all, but it comes up with increasing frequency that they'll simply, at the airport, stop you and insist upon a body search. Now, I know that I've spent a great deal of my life covering the Soviet Union in the bad days, and I don't want to make comparisons here that I've lived. But what is going on? And you hear this all over, and so there are questions, and there is fear. Somebody was saying to me the other day, and explaining, because I asked them, what is this tariff all about? And people who know a great deal more about it than I were trying to explain to me that some of them who are very much hooked in with the Trump administration, and they were saying to me that you have to understand, when the president spoke about Liberation Day on April 2nd, he had in mind a master plan. Economically, everything would be working according to a plan that had been thought through. At the very same time, I happened to pick up a newspaper, and there was a quote from the president, which I have here, and the president says, "It's more of an instinct, I think, than anything else." And there is that embarrassing collision between people who speak on behalf of the president, speaking about a plan and a golden age that will emerge from the implementation of this plan. And then the president himself, who gives way to momentary candor every now and then that is more believable than some of the things said by his top aides. The Treasury Secretary, Bassett, and the Commerce Secretary, whose name I'm always forgetting, they are both talking about specific plans at the very same time that the president is bowing in the direction of his instinct. And I find it very hard, since I don't live in that world, but simply trying to sort of look over the fence into a world of national and international economics and trade. I cannot believe, for example, that if you look at the front page of the Washington Post today, take a look at those jagged lines. Those are the lines of the last 4 days. What do those lines say to you? Up and down wildly. That is not stability. And while I don't know a great deal about economics and investment, I do know that if you want to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in the new factories that the president insists are going to be built in this country very, very soon, turning the American economy around and producing this golden age, as he puts it, you do not want to be involved in this kind of uncertainty. Why invest this kind of money in an environment that is so filled with question marks rather than stability? And you begin to think, last Wednesday, April 2nd, the president came out very boldly with this new tariff plan. And it was, in a way, terrifying, because he was imposing tariffs larger than the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. In other words, he was going back 100 years and going beyond what had been a big deal back then, and which only worsened America's opportunity to avoid the Deep Depression that followed. And the president talks about this again as though it's part of a big plan, and he speaks about it with a kind of confidence, a certainty that this is the way it is going to be. And yet, within 1 week, he changes his mind. Based upon what? Here you don't know exactly. But what I read, what I'm told, is that the bond market, more than anything else, frightened him. And he spoke in a funny kind of way yesterday about how people around him get kind of queasy. And I wonder really whether he was speaking autobiographically then, because maybe he too was getting a bit queasy when the bond market, which has so much to do with real estate, so much to do with what it is that he does know. And so he decided after 1 week to flip. But even in the flipping, the market itself is still not stable, far from it. Although yesterday, after his announcement, the market shot up 2,000-3,000 points. Amazing. President said the greatest plus market in American history. He may be right. But today, the market has already slipped a full point. The last I looked, it was 900 points down. Think about that, please, in terms of stability and the president saying this pause will be for 90 days. But when you examine it, it's not a pause across the board, not at all. The 10% raise in tariffs that he spoke about last week, they remain in place, affecting almost every country in the world except one big one, namely Russia, which we can talk about later. But that's one big country excluded, but everyone else included in the 10%. Most of the time, American taxes, I'm told, are at the 2% level. This is going to be at 10%. Mexico and Canada still in line for 25% tariff increases. with Canada for aluminum, with steel, with smaller items, agricultural material. Likewise, Mexico, providing all kinds of things that the president wants, and at the same time trying to hold off 25% tariffs on automobiles themselves and parts of automobiles constructed in Mexico, but based upon parts produced by the United States. So they still have 25%. The rest of the world at 10%. And then the big elephant in the room, that's China. China has immediately struck back in a reciprocal tariff of 84% on all American goods from the US into China, 84%. And that is in response to the president imposing a 125% tariff on all Chinese goods coming into the United States. And Adam, what's sort of amusing here is that I don't know if it was a typo, but I saw about 20 minutes ago that it was 145% now, but I don't know if that's true. But stick to 125. What does that say? Again, in terms of our pursuit of stability, which is what the president's aides are saying we're going to get. This is a picture now of the 10% across the board with key allies such as Mexico and Canada. I'm not sure that they consider themselves allies of the United States any. That's a separate issue. But former allies such as Canada and Mexico, 25%, and then China. So economically, the United States stands now in a trade war with China, and you have the two most important economic powers in the world now contesting one on the other. That is not only a definition of instability, it is a definition of incredible danger. China is flexing its muscles now after 1,500 years of sitting on the sidelines and not liking it. And the United States is sort of at the top, and yet we all know that it's a very shaky top. And we've begun to slide a bit as well. Are we heading into what is larger than a trade war? Who knows? Will all of this instability and conflict lead to certainly recession in the United States, higher prices, economic instability? Probably. And that is, in my book, a very frightening thing. I said before about fear of being in newsrooms and law firms and universities. It certainly is in this office here. Adam, I'm an old man and I'm not supposed to be frightened anymore. What's going to happen to me? But I'm scared to death. And I am not embarrassed to share that with friends such as we have here.
Well, we have a number of friends, former colleagues, and others who've joined us. We invite you to submit questions and comments by putting them into chat. And while you're getting organized, Marvin, you talked about some of our politics and economic strategies going back to 100 years ago. Right. And we're seeing some changes in politics that also are reminiscent of earlier 20th century. The attitudes toward foreign policy have become incredibly polarized. 70%, this is a Wall Street Journal poll last week, 77% of Republicans back tariffs. 93% of Democrats don't. 92% of Republicans back cuts in foreign aid. 85% of Democrats oppose them. 79% of Republicans oppose U.S. financial aid to Ukraine. 83% of Democrats favor it. This is new. This wasn't the case 10 or 15 years ago. So you have to wonder what is happening.
It is certainly new. It certainly is a flip-flop in the positions of the two major parties in this country. 20 years ago, or even much less than that time, recently, maybe even 10 to 15 years ago, a Republican very proudly would speak in terms of free trade, would speak in terms of support for NATO and our allies around the world, starting in Western Europe, then Australia, New Zealand, Japan. And by the way, just dipping back a moment to the tariffs, we have been making as a nation such a huge effort to be nice to Vietnam, and Vietnam in agreement has sort of held hands with the US, and economic trade relations have improved dramatically between the two countries, and for reasons having nothing to do with sanity. The United States has imposed a 46% tariff on Vietnam, knowing full well that Vietnam lives on trade, mostly with countries such as the United States. Getting back to your central point, the two parties have flipped. And in my judgment, I have a feeling that Trump is largely responsible for taking an underlying current, a change of opinion within the Republican Party, and he's pushed it over the top. So that right now, because Republicans are so frightened of disagreeing with Trump on anything, getting back to my first point about how Congress has become this obedient lapdog to the White House. Congress will never do anything now to conflict with what it is that Trump wants. Before Trump instituted this 90-day pause on the tariffs, which I hope we all understand is quite misleading, but nevertheless, that is what Wall Street wanted, and that's what they got. At this point, we're sort of stuck as a nation between a desire to do something sensible about our foreign policy, and yet trapped in Trump's vision of the world. And his vision of the world is largely a function of old age republicanism. What I mean by that is he is thinking to a time in the not too distant past when the Republicans would have eagerly supported Ukraine against Russia. And now, as your numbers indicate, Adam, they're starting. I think you said 79% of Republicans oppose aid to Ukraine.
Right.
And that number about a year ago was much, much lower than that.
Yep.
It was the Democrats who were sort of in and out, but then they were supportive of the Biden policy, which was to support Ukraine. So right now, I mentioned earlier about Russia being the one sort of major country that has not been touched by the tariffs. That's kind of interesting. Russia, despite the fact that it is a superpower, despite the fact that it has more nuclear weapons than any other country on earth, including China, including the US. So Putin wants to stand out as a major force, and he is a major force, and he demonstrates that force by the use of his military power. But what Trump, who is not a student of history, does not quite grasp is that right now, Putin is probably in a far more vulnerable position in terms of his own status in the power structure of Russia than at any time in the last 25 years. Maybe back in 2013 and 14, there were demonstrations against him. Now there are no demonstrations against him, but there are a lot of deep forces at work, which are extremely important. And they indicate that the US now should not be bending down before Putin and yielding to him on major issues in a negotiation that ought to be left for the key moments in the negotiation, not at the very beginning, before we get started. Trump has already said you can have 20% of Ukraine. He's already said you don't have to join NATO. In other words, he's given away a couple of the major points. And it strikes me as foolish because at this particular point, people, not publicly, but some even publicly, have voiced questions about what it is that Putin did in invading Ukraine. At the time that he invaded, the security forces in Russia, which we know now, didn't know then. The security forces in Russia told Putin that he would be able, with a major military force, to take control of Ukraine within 3 days to a week. Well, as we know, as we're in the 4th year of this war now, it is hardly a walk in the woods. It has been a monstrously difficult war for both countries. There's no question about that. But Russia started, Putin started, with a certain image in mind, and it hasn't worked out. It is the biggest strategic blunder of a major international figure in centuries, because he has pitted everything in a defeat of Ukraine, and he's not getting it. In addition, Ukraine, in the vision of the world until this war, was a new country, deep political corruption, uncertainty about whether it could actually emerge as a state, is now a state without any question because of the war against Russia. Because of that war, Ukraine has come into its own. Within Russia today, people, wives, mothers, sisters, the same kind of thing that happened when the Russians were tied up in Afghanistan, they're now tied in Ukraine, and their women folk have been rising silently, but with increasing influence, expressing their dissatisfaction and not knowing what it is that is happening, except husbands and brothers have suddenly vanished. The estimate that the British put out, confirmed in the US and very indirectly by the Russians, 200,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in this war in the last 3 years. Think about that. 60, 70,000 a year. What does that do to the internal fabric of that country, stability of the country? In addition, 600,000 wounded. Those are huge figures. In addition, Putin has just issued an order for an additional 160,000 Russian troops. That means he wants them from 18 years of age to 30. In other words, he wants young men who can fight. Where are these young men who can fight? They're not volunteering now. Very small numbers. volunteer. Most of them have to be picked up, literally off the streets. And they're not succeeding in rounding up the figures that they claim they want. In addition, the birth rate in Russia is falling dramatically. Russia started this war at 143,000 people. They're a little lower than that now, but the numbers for the next, I don't know how you look at it, but the numbers over the next 10 years are likely to be a significant continuing drop. That is not a strong country. The economy of Russia, it's hard to believe what I'm about to say, but the economy of Russia can be measured as similar to Costa Rica. Now, I've got nothing against Costa Rica. It's a lovely country. But do you consider it a superpower? No. Would you consider Russia a superpower because of the nuclear weapons that they have? And that is the key danger right now in the US-Russian relationship. That Putin, who is no fool, knows that he has a lot of problems. And he is playing Trump like a Stradivarius. He sends Trump a painting of Trump done by a leading Russian artist. Come on. I mean, when was the last time? I do not know of any time when, in the last 100 years, for example, somebody would be painting a portrait of Roosevelt or Nixon or Reagan in order to gain admittance to the White House. They didn't do it. But Putin, who has said himself, my greatest strength is I know how to deal with people because of his KGB background. And he knows how to deal with Trump. He builds up his ego. He sends him paintings, but he doesn't give him what he wants on the battlefield. Trump, with a big hoo-ha, said he wanted a 30, he wanted, within 30 days, he wanted a ceasefire. He's not getting that. And he's not getting that because Putin won't give it to him. Zelensky did. So we are in, I think, very dangerous time. The president speaks rightly about how angry, how pissed off he is at Putin. But when it comes to actions that matter, on the tariffs, for example, Russia is excluded, meaning Russia, you're okay. You and I get along just fine. And I think the president's living in the framework of three big powers, Russia, China, the United States, governing everybody else. And I think that's a wacky idea.
Well, we're getting several questions now from those who've joined us. And there's one which really can build on what you were just saying, which is if you could comment on the trajectory of America as a world leader in this century. And I would add to that, compare that to the trajectories of Russia and China, two countries you've covered and know well.
Russia is a basket case. As I said, Russia has a strong reliance on nuclear weapons that is incredibly dangerous, especially in the hands of a leader who feels himself insecure, despite the projection of strength that he conveys. This is an insecure Russian leader. And there's nothing in Russian history nor in the reality today that would suggest that Russia is going to burst into the open and have a great, magnificent future. No. Different from China. The Chinese are, say the obvious, very different from the Russians. The Chinese have many bumps in the road, but they are projecting toward the future based upon what has happened in the recent past. A powerful economy, a powerful military, and they envisage in their own minds going back to China in the 12th and 13th centuries. We don't know much about Chinese history, so it comes as a great shock to many of us. But in the 12th and 13th century, China was a world power with a navy of such strength that it carried Chinese merchandise all over the world, opening up the Middle East, for example. And China as a military threat in those days was universal. You did not mess with the Middle Kingdom. And they have that vision in their minds today of an expanding, powerful China that the world will respect. I do not have that feeling. I hope that I'm wrong, frankly. I don't have that feeling about the US at the moment. We appear to be stuck because the US has an opportunity with AI at this point. We're in the forefront of that technological revolution, and we could be pushing forward on that front. And I have a feeling we would do very well if we did, but Trump now and for the next 3 years, certainly, he has a different vision. He is kind of poo-pooing the AI future for America and is looking back 50, 60 years to building up the coal industry. He did recently talk and then turned around to a number of coal miners, brought in especially, and said, you guys agree with me, right? We're going to open up these mines. We're going to do great stuff with coal. And of course they said yes. But if your vision as a leader is coal, when you should be dealing with AI, I think that we're kind of stuck there. So of the three biggies in the world, there is one biggie that seems to be moving in a powerful position, one that can't get off its stuff, that's Russia, and the United States in a state of utter confusion and uncertainty and chaos.
We've got a couple of questions relating to domestic politics, responses to Trump, and some vis-a-vis foreign affairs. I'll pick one and try to incorporate some of the others. One of the questions points out that Trump's support never reaches 50%. It's 40-something percent, and he's consistently, if you look at the Real Clear Politics average of all the polls, he's consistently, his support is consistently lower than opposition. And so a question is, if more people oppose him than favor him, what can that majority do? And perhaps another way of putting it is, can the Democrats get their act together?
Yeah, well, there are two big questions there. One of them has to do with the Republican Party and where it is today with respect to Trump. The other is the Democratic Party and where it is with respect to itself and to its principles and where its future lies. It's very interesting that right now you could find small pinpricks of criticism of Trump among Republicans. And that was concentrated in this last week, having to do with the tariffs and having to do with the American stock market falling by $12 trillion. When you talk about $12 trillion, who are the people who have $12 trillion? They're obviously very wealthy people who gain a great deal of money, acquire a great deal of money by knowing how to, quote, play the market. For example, this is much too cynical of you, and I apologize if I offend anyone. It is entirely possible, however, that when Trump and his people announced the tariffs, they knew that the market would fall and fall dramatically, which it did. And if it falls, you anticipate the fall and you buy in at that time, and then you have a 90-day pause and the market shoots up, you have made a great deal of money, huge amounts. That suggests a corruption of massive dimension. And I'm not even sure that the Trump people have the ability to pull that off. So let's say that is kind of a game that might have been played, but may not have. But the insecurity is still there. The market today is falling, it's not going up. And maybe tomorrow it'll go up. But that again, I've mentioned this before, that's that same instability. That is not the basis on which you plan anything. If the United States economy begins to hurt, it's going to hurt not just Democrats, it's going to hurt Republicans too. And many of those Republicans may decide that their wallets are more important than their love affair with the president. And they're going to lose some of their cult-like appeal for the president. And you don't need a lot of Republicans to peel away for the Democrats to rise into a majority position. The Republicans right now are in a, I forgot the number, but in a 43 or 4% of the public on a positive side. If the market, we will know by the end of this month, the effect of the tariffs on popular perception, public perception of American economics, and therefore of the president himself. And if the president's numbers have dropped from 48 to 44 already, before the tariffs are taken into account, we will see at the end of the month and find out what's happening. The point is that it is through the economic weakness of the United States. And by the way, we are not a weak country economically. We have enormous economic power if it is applied. And this administration chooses not to. That's a political, but it's also for Trump an emotional, personal decision. But it is through the economic side that I believe there will be the beginning of a meaningful peeling away of Republican support for Trump. Not the hardcore, they will stay there, but you don't need them. You need that gray zone between 44% and 35%. And you're going to find a significant change. If he goes under 40 by the end of this month, something meaningful has happened that could have important political consequences.
On a different subject, which you actually raised at the beginning, which is universities. If you could comment on anti-Semitism, responses to it, and I would just add a quote from former President Obama, who said last week, I mean, it's 2 weeks ago, in a speech on a university campus, he called for universities to be prepared to lose government funding. And he said, you should be able to say, that's why we got this big endowment.
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
Well, I'm terrified about what's happening now at universities. And I started to be terrified last year when there were these violent, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli, and ultimately anti-Semitic demonstrations on many, many campuses around the country. Those kinds of demonstrations have dropped very dramatically, but it festers. And the president, for political reasons, personal reasons, wanting to persuade the right wing of American Jewry that he's with you and he's with Israel, and therefore he's against all anti-Semites. Maybe he is. I can't say one way or the other. But if his way of demonstrating that he opposes anti-Semitism is to crack down on people who are expressing their opinion about a war, or their opinion about a foreign country, in this case, Israel, they have every right to do that in a country that is free and open and democratic. But in a country that is losing its democracy, I said in an article this week that the United States is devolving day by day into an autocracy. And I explained my reasoning before about how the three branches of government have changed. And we have now one dominant branch of government. And that dominant branch of government is latching on to anti-Semitism as a reason to smash academic freedom at universities. That is unacceptable. And I think that most American Jews will not accept that and are most sympathetic to people who are expressing that point of view, not with violence, not with extremism, but if they write an article, if they walk around peacefully and express their view, I have no problem with that. And I think most people do not. But what is going on, it is heartbreaking to imagine a young woman who was picked up, where was she? Tufts, I believe, picked up and hustled off to a prison in Louisiana. For what reason? She co-wrote an editorial for the school newspaper criticizing Israel on Gaza? No, you don't do that. Not in a free country. You don't do that. And if that be an expression of your support of American Jews, drop it. We can do without it.
A question about how the United States is treating allies, or maybe former allies. So NATO, Canada, the Canadians are furious, others around the world. How does this play out? Does this create an opening for China or others to replace American influence?
There is no question that that has happened all over the world today. And that is one of the splitting off qualities of the economic warfare, trade warfare between the United States and China. You get into that kind of conflict, and at this particular point, if it be simply economic, bad enough. But if you get into that kind of conflict, it's going to spread into many, many other areas, and the Chinese will be able to play on split emotions in Korea, South Korea, in Australia, in India, in Western Europe. Think if you are right now in Estonia, or Latvia, or Lithuania, and everybody knows that the NATO treaty says in Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on one. You look and read what it is that the President of the United States of America has said in answer to that question, would you support if there were Russian action against Estonia or the Baltics in any way? His answer, I believe, was, I have to think about that. That is not what Article 5 says. Article 5 says you don't think about it, you are obligated to take action. And if it is now clear that we're not going to be taking action, but we're going to think about it, I believe that the essence of the NATO spirit, as well as what is written in the documentation for NATO, I think that has been vitiated. It has lost its vitality. It becomes meaningless. And this has all happened in a lightning quick time. People in Europe today believe the new leader in Germany is saying right out loud, we can't depend on the United States anymore. That means that the Europeans are going to have to build up their own military. They can't depend on us. Build up their own military means they have to change their economy to put tons of money now into the military, which they had not been forced to do because we've always been there. But that understanding of economic cooperation producing strategic collaboration and support, that I think is gone. Could it be reconstituted? Possibly. But it's going to take a very long time. The damage that has already been done by this administration to America's position around the world is shocking and very, very damaging.
And in just a few months.
In just a few months. I thank you. Thank you.
I can't resist asking you, of all the people on this call, have far more experience covering the Soviet Union and Moscow and studying Russia. And you have described how you learned about Khrushchev's critical speech in the 1950s with leads that you discovered as a young reporter by hanging out with students. So who do you read today? Who is it that gives the kind of information that we don't get from RT or from official Putin statements? Where do we find that kind of information? Where do you find that kind of information?
Yeah, from different sources and surprising sources. I have acknowledged to you before we got started today how limited my command is of the new technology. And so I'm not very good on picking up, for example, what the outlet called Telegram produces in Russia. But it is through Telegram that Russians communicate with one another about the war. And it's through Telegram that there are, I don't want to call them reporters, but there are people who sort of cover the war, and they speak with unusual candor. And they actually criticize Putin and criticize official Russian policy toward Ukraine. And so people who follow Russia today do depend on these oddball new social media structures like Telegram and others, the names of which I don't know, but you come upon by connecting to Telegram, and then it takes you into some of these others, and you learn a great deal, by the way. Another thing which is surprising but very rewarding are letters. Not every letter that you send to a Russian actually gets through to that Russian, but some of them do. And they, with remarkable courage, send you letters back about what has happened to their family, what has happened to their community where they are, what has happened to their access to food, to their ability to criticize Putin. All of these things are there, but it takes time. And the first time you're apt to fail, but I'm going. It isn't the reporting that I did and other wonderful American reporters working in the Soviet Union did. We were doing it traditionally, the normal reporting job. Today, that is not possible because Putin has really cracked down. I don't want to say 100%, but 90% on what it is that Russian reporters can say. It's very rough to be a reporter. It's very dangerous. You say something out of line, you're going to find yourself dead and under a car or just shot. So it's a totally different world in terms of journalism and coverage of Russia. You have to be a good reporter, but also just a good person. What I found among Russians that there is an initial instinct, which is to hold off the foreigner, not to listen to the foreigner. But once you break through that initial wall of resistance, the Russians become a very warm people, and you can talk to them. I found in my experience, once you break through, you become lifelong friends. And you were able, decades later, to write to them, and get a bounce, a very positive bounce. I find the coverage now, not only of Russia, but of the United States, be very troublesome. And I know, Adam, we just about run out of time. But just very quickly, what is happening now with the AP in this country, again, terrifies me. The judge has said the AP deserves the same rights that any other outfit would have. And the other day, they were denied access to the president once again, the reporter and a photographer. In other words, again, we go back to the beginning now about the judicial system. That system, parts of it are brave and say the right thing. But how many divisions has the Pope? You get back to that idea. Yes, it is right what the courts are saying. But if the president chooses not to listen, who's to stop him? And that is that terrifying feature of the Trump administration.
Well, we are out of time, but for those who want an example of your kind of reporting breaking through to the Russian people, there was a broadcast you did, I believe it was CBS Reports, the Volga story, where you traveled through villages and you had a minder, but you, if I recall correctly, you said you had a lot of vodka with the minder. And then the minder would go to sleep and you would go out with a camera crew and talk to Russian. You speak fluent Russian. And so that was one way of getting through to real Russians. I'm sure that must be on YouTube somewhere. But
Adam, that was one of the best experiences I had. They wouldn't let us do things so that we went until it fell asleep. We did it anyway.
Well, I was actually in the Soviet Union then. Hughes Royd was the bureau manager in Moscow, if I recall, and we were waiting for the authorities to throw CBS out of Moscow, and they didn't do it for a while. They were very clever. I was not there for CBS, I should add. I was, although they found some CBS memos in my bag, and I said, vacation. They said, oh no, CBS News memorandum. But they let me leave. Well, Marvin Kalb, we don't want to let you leave, but we know that our time is up and you have another commitment. Thank you so much for spending the last hour with us, and please come back.
Thank you, Adam. I shall. Thanks to everybody.
Thanks to all of you for joining.